So let me start today by just thanking some people. Margaret, who doesn't pay via email, sent me a nice check. And I thank you, Margaret C. You know who you are. Mary Jo B, Ben C, and David D, DR. Thank you all very much. A couple of those recurring. Do appreciate it, as you know. Appreciate all of you guys as time's gone by, sending donations in support. Yeah, it's. I think there is some sort of. I don't know how it works with certain numbers of subscribers, but there is some funding coming in through the YouTube now. Over my shoulder here, I meant to show it last week during the Brackman discussion. It's just show a little pastel I did under Brackman in those days. It's fairly like what he did. I'm not going to pull it out and talk in detail about it. Maybe if you get a shot at it, you can see the evidence of the angle chunking way of drawing under the pastel. James B. Makes an interesting point. It's very, I'd say it's very nuanced point, and he's almost right in what he says. He says, you say that copying the style of others is a poor thing, and yet you endorse the influence of the past. You can't have it both ways. So that's an interesting point. I mean, if you take the word style to mean mannerisms, like a peculiar way of making a toe and that sort of thing, you would understand one way of thinking about style. There is an element of elongated figures that El Greco does. That's something that we would call in his style at times. That's the thing he does. That's what I'm saying. I think it's. Well, I don't think maybe the word's even unsavory. I was thinking about not using that word, but I think it's what it is. The reason I use pastiche in the title of this one. You're not trying to become somebody else, to imitate or look like, but borrowing the values. That is, say, you study artists to see what they know that can be of help to you, and there's a lot of stuff that you're needing to know. But the last thing you need to know is a thing called style. Now, if you say, for example, in making the middle tones, there are three styles. Let's just say that there are three. A light meets a dark. Maybe on this side of my hand, a light meets a dark, and I wonder if we can see that. Light meets dark, and there's a midtone right here. Now, a person could block in, as we did with Gamble, and block in with a square edge right here, and have to noodle up the middle tone down the middle of it. Or if you're a put down, leave it kind of painter, you just chunk a middle tone in there. Now, you could say that's one style. Another, and by the way, in those sorts of styles, you can model from dark to light, or you can model from light to dark. That could be said to be a style, right? So it depends on what you mean, the word style, as a way of doing it. And then there's another possibility, and that is that you paint a big fat middle tone there and do the modeling from the lights into the middle tone and from the darks into the middle tone. Now, these are all ways, methodologies, if you want to call them that, but you could call them styles of making the middle tone. And it's, I haven't addressed all the issues, and I'm not recommending any of these in particular, but you'll see them all over the place, people doing things like that. So if you mean something like that, you can find best practices for example, I was talking about when you draw the outline and then model it up this way. How about we could reverse that? How about we do the modeling first? We blow on a big form, then find the line in that. Is that a thing we might try doing? One guy tends to do it more the other way, more one way than the other way. And you could say that's a case of style. That's his style. But stylization, in the sense of the Rubens thing, I'll talk about some of that stuff, even Michelangelo. Let me just talk about some of that. But I think you can and must, in fact, have it both ways. You don't want to be a mannerist who paints the paintings that have been done in the past. And that's all that's all I mean by that. You don't want to borrow somebody else's entire thing and then just become a little modern version of that thing. Everybody wants to and perforce must have his own identity, his own fingerprints on his work. You can't actually copy somebody else very well without dedicating yourself to being that other person. You do see people who do imitate Sargent closely, and people who imitate Sorolla closely. But ways of working is one thing, and trying to look like somebody is a different thing, right? So I'm going to show you some ways in which people, how painters in the past, all the painters I know and respect have studied the painters before them, but they don't look like the painters before them, right? I mean, incrementally, of course, the changes over through history are relatively incremental, but they aren't trying to be that other person, and that like that other way of working is like suddenly valid more than your way of working would be valid, right? I mean, in other words, you applying some stylistic thing. If they're doing something like that, should you do that? Is there some permission you have to have not to do that? That's a very interesting, longer discussion. But let's just look at some pictures. The first one here is I'm referencing this because I actually should have shown a Raphael in the left corner instead of Michelangelo. But Raphael said the drawing of Michelangelo in the color of Titian. He's said to have said that. I don't remember that's Vasari or where that comes from. And you remember what he's doing is he's trying to find his way in painting. And he's trying to decide, he's looking at pictures by all sorts of people. He says he's looking at Michelangelo, and perhaps if it were like these two, he would see that Michelangelo's color isn't lively, it doesn't feel lifelike. And that whole near atmosphere thing, some people like to think of Titian as the first impressionist, that capacity to create the entire atmosphere sort of an area like this one does, is you can see how that would be appealing to somebody. The Giorgione and the guys, and the Venetians in general, really, really brought color. And even in the earlier days before those guys, there was a color element that's very impressive in those guys. It's not the same with other people. I could show you Michelangelo as I've talked about the color in his Sistine ceiling on some of those Libyan Sibyls. It's remarkably beautiful. But that's Raphael saying, I want this of this guy and this of that guy. Well, you look at the body of his work and he doesn't do either one precisely. And Michelangelo's, of course, when you talk about his drawing, that's what, that would impress anybody, right? Just on the face of it, that would impress you. And as highly skilled draftsmanship, right? Powerfully expressing the human figure with chalk. So what's not to like? And those are the two guys that are fairly near him that he could approximate or he could take to learn from. But here's one of the other guys on the left. That's Botticelli. I'm showing a Botticelli drawing. Botticelli would also have been there with an ability to influence, as well as, by the way, Leonardo, of course. So the influence would have been there. And this is Raphael on the right. Apparently, the legs really do look like a Raphael, a particular one actually. So. In some ways, this doesn't remind me. I mean, actually, the Eisen area, those areas up there, remind me of Pontormo. Maybe Raphael learned something from Pontormo. I don't know how close an age they are. But nevertheless, the stylistic stuff, you can see that he's really not doing Michelangelo. His stuff could be said to be somewhere in between Botticelli and Michelangelo, right? He's got a strong sense of form. But he draws in thin lines frequently and so on. That's, what am I saying? What is that thing? But we all learn things from painters as the opportunity comes up. And remember, we're all looking to them. Primarily, we're looking to them for how they interpret nature, not for how they succeed in interpreting nature, not for their style in interpreting nature, but for their means. How in the world did the guy get, for example, if that's true, just the previous Titian, if that's true, and they're very slow on me tonight, Mr. Producer. We know about this, but we'd like to know how he managed to make that sky look so believable, assuming, by the way, this painting looks this good in that way. But we would like to know how he's doing that. Everybody, when Monet showed up, was trying to figure out how he was doing that. That doesn't mean they were going to borrow, and very few people actually borrowed what you call the manner of Monet. Almost nobody did. But everybody messed with it. So you could say, learning from the past will be messing with what he's doing and trying to understand it by buying right in, which is what I did when I studied with Brackman. I just bought right into his way of working. I just did exactly what he said. I had nothing else. And when I got to Gamma, I bought right into what he was saying. And so, but would you say it's a style? Yeah, well, in one sense, they're very different in their approach to painting. So in one sense, you'd call that style, but it's not style in the sense of stylization, which is what I'm trying to get you to think twice about borrowing. It'd be really nice if this would go a little faster. I'm trying to get us over to the next slide, and it's going very slow. So here I'm showing you Rubens, who obviously was influenced by Michelangelo. By the way, remember what Da Vinci thought of Michelangelo. He referred to the bodies as bags of walnuts. He didn't think much of that interpretation, that style, so he wasn't going to be learning from Michelangelo in that way. But Michelangelo has a great sense of form, and if you're a student of painting, you would copy him to try to understand how he's doing that. What's happening? How does he get his form to look so good? And you'll begin to understand middle tones and turning form and values in general. So this Rubens in the middle, you can what Rubens does is he exaggerates form. He really blows it up, like he blows air into every little muscle, like a guy who's trying to impress the girls, shall we say, and goes bodybuilding, but it's all air. It's all just appearance muscles. Well, I'm not picking on Rubens. I didn't mean to do it that way, but you can see that there's a sense of like dramatic exaggeration in his work, and you could say that same might be true of Michelangelo. It does, those kinds of things tend to express something in particular. And if you had a desire, for example, to understand how a painter got that sense of grandeur in a picture, you would probably spend time copying that picture to see if you could begin to see if you could understand what happened to give that feeling of grandeur in the picture, or in this case of power in the figure construction. I was showing this to show the back on the figure on the right, connected a little bit with the Michelangelo here. So this one over here is, I think you guys liked the laser with this computer, so does it work? Is it working tonight, Mr. Producer? Yeah, I hope so. Anyway, you see what I'm talking about. This back over here, very, very full. By the way, style is, for example, if you make a man, you make him a muscle man every time you make him. That's a stylistic choice too, but that goes to your pictures. In some pictures, that would be the right choice. Other pictures, your character wouldn't be plausible if he's just an average guy that doesn't work in the field, shall we say. So, and here's Michelangelo, and he's borrowing from the Greeks. Now, the thing that makes the Renaissance is that they went back to see what these guys were doing because they were really looking for better models. But it doesn't mean they were trying to evolve a style. They were trying to figure out how to make nature in front of them more beautifully true, which is what they found in the Renaissance. And that still holds up. Those players in this is the Belvedere torso on the left. I think this river god on the right is an ancient sculpture. It looks like it could very well, and maybe it is part of the Parthenon, but I think not. But you can see Michelangelo in these two figures. He's not copying these guys, but he's borrowed. Now, this is a style. You want to talk about style? He's borrowed that sense of great body muscle. Right? He's borrowed something about this manly model or whatever it is he's doing. He's trying to express that, and he admires the great interpretation of the male form in the Belvedere torso, and talks about it. He loved nothing more than this guy. But he mentions both of these guys at different times. This one, but in this one, he's doing the graceful river god. This is a study either from that and or for one of the the dawn and the morning and evening sculptures that he did for the tomb of the Medicis. But you should be able to see that he's actually copying or has copied or has borrowed from these guys, but he might have borrowed their spirit rather than simply their modeling or something like that, right? Now we know about this school in New York started by Pivar, where all these young students were, and I don't know if maybe they still have learned to draw like Michelangelo, and they muscle things up and all that sort of thing. That's stylization in the way I'm saying. I would rather people didn't do it. Now, by the way, you should do it all day if it's appropriate for the subject that you're working. So that's not an issue. But to live in somebody else's interpretation of life, of nature, and all that sort of thing, instead of finding your own by studying nature longer, and occasionally finding best practices through the players like Michelangelo. You keep remembering these guys are you're going to them in the same sense as Ang says. You're going to them. You're studying nature through them. You follow me? He says, "I send you to the Louvre." This is the quote. So you'll learn to see nature from antique statues, because they themselves are nature. You must live on them, devour them. So it's this search for truth. I'm talking about the truth of the look of nature now. That is such a dominant thing in the thinking of Ang. And it's also that with anybody who wants to be his own person, nature is the source. So that's the big argument against borrowing style, just to have a style. Ang, on the other hand, was a remarkable stylist. he takes and does in one of his odalisque pictures. He really has the look of Persian art. He looks like he studied Persian art. You might say borrowed stylistically. But that's a different motive. In this case here, both David on the right, I think that's the Oath of the Horatii. Is it? Or is that the death of, it looks like the death of Socrates. In that case, they're borrowing Greek forms that they probably got from, I'm showing on the left here, the Parthenon. These are figures that are very true, not stylized, not the Romans immediately preceding the Renaissance guys. Their sculpture wasn't fantastic, in in other words, there was something about it that was good, and it's extolled also at times by Michelangelo. But they go back to the Greeks and some of the more ancient sculpture. But it's because of its truth and its expressiveness, right? And so they find best practices in stone, shall we say, or whatever it is that Michelangelo is using, but it's all about, well, don't you see? And this is what we all do. Don't you see that this gets you? I've said to you many times, the reason I'm doing Impressionism at all, as we call it, is because it gives me a more powerful, more thorough truth. A truth that saturates through every pore of the painting. And doesn't have these problematical things, shall we say, like called outlines, that make it look false, that is visually false, right? So so you study somebody, you're looking around, and one of the things that immediately struck me about having been with Bregman, this struck me about, and Dan Green and some others, but what struck me about Joseph de Camp was that his pictures, in each of those guys, their pictures are holistic. They don't have this piecemeal separation, and therefore it looks more true in that way. I mean, there's nothing untrue about the apotheosis of Homer there in one sense, apart from it just being a sideshow sort of look about it. But and it never happened. But he's got the perspective right. He got the sizes of people right, and all that sort of stuff. And he's treating this, by the way, like a frieze, which is that whole thing about low relief. He talks about that at times. But he treats the whole thing like a frieze, and that's borrowed for sure. The very idea of a frieze and to treat a painting that way, so there's no atmospheric depth. This isn't anything. It has the same light in the sky and all the rest of that stuff, but it doesn't have atmospheric depth. It's a funny expression that I know people have condemned, but people meaning to God. But nevertheless, it is one of those characteristics of the holistic approach to painting, where everything is considered when you're looking at a field. But these guys are all, as I said, painting piecemeal. You have rather to work piecemeal. What they would have gotten possibly would be closer to the El Jaleo by Sargent if they actually understood the whole world visual in the way Sargent did. The tonalist mentality gets you that same sense of depth that the Impressionist does, to the extent that their edge play is well tuned. The truth of the edge relationships, and not focus on the outside of objects. But that's not what I meant to get into. So here are these guys. You can see they're literally borrowing style. This is Greek. The figures all look Greek, and some of them like particular Greeks, but they look like what you would find in Greek sculpture, and people like Leighton and others do the same thing. But Greek sculpture, the Parthenon probably is one of the richest sources. I don't know how many of those pieces they saw in their day. Now, here's Rubens copying Titian. And so what did he do? Did he become a Titian? I mean, I wish he had in some ways because the burden of style is so heavy on him. But this just shows you he's copying somebody. But you won't find that he becomes Reuben. I mean, except to the extent that he shows fattiness on legs. He seemed to get a kick out of that. Did he learn that from, well, was that a stylistic thing? What is that now? But Rubens is one of the biggest painter names coming out of, when Rubens is coming up there, is one of the biggest names in history at that point, in the sense of the kind of pictures he's putting together. And Sargent copies Tintoretto. Tintoretto had a sort of a stylistic flair, that reminds me of Sargent. And I wonder to what extent Sargent was interested in copying him because Tintoretto already had that quality, that sort of swagger, if you want to call it that, in his drawing and painting, a sort of a drama of sorts. Happens differently in Sargent, but it seems to be there. I mean, Sargent also copied Franz Hals and Lawrence, the British painter. He copied a lot of people, but he's not those guys per se. I don't see any evidence that he tried to be any of them per se. At some point, your way of getting there, you find your own efficiencies, and you claim your own place in history. But did he copy it to borrow stylistically? He could have. I'm not going to say he didn't, but here's Degas copying Titian. This is Titian. I apologize, people. It's Mantegna. I really got that wrong. Oops. Can somebody strike that? Can you put a cross mark through that, Mr. Producer? Oh, golly. What am I thinking? I remember talking to Gamble once about Mantegna. I knew Gamble liked him, and I said, I do like his compositions. I like so much. I like him a lot, but his drawing is so hard. And Gamble said, "What's wrong with hard?" I had on the other end of things a Correggio in mind, or even a Rubens. There's an element of soft roundness, that seems more of what nature is doing, right? So I suppose if you want to learn how to paint hard, you copy Mantegna, right? Find out what his tricks are. I wanted to say something, and that is that when you're copying to find out how the masters handled painting, to learn about painting from painters, right? But you also learn from them how they handled nature, and you're learning from them things that you couldn't have figured out for yourself. For example, you might turn the back on the form of this soldier, on this guy back here. You might say if you hadn't become a master of turning form yet, you might try to copy that quite closely, and see if you could make your form turn as well as that. And in the process, you'd probably notice things that the painter was doing. Again, that would be stylistic in the sense of this is how I turn the form to make it look true. Again, not the idea of style meaning hard or meaning a sort of flabby and serpentine, as I talk about Rubens sometimes. But nevertheless, all these guys are copying, and they're copying for various reasons, and the reasons are all over the place. If you're trying to understand a good composition, if you find a composition, you say, I got to understand that I really like that composition. It's a really good thing to do, copy it. Or we're talking about the design of a rectangle. One of the most important things you can learn from painters is how they manage rectangles. Don't look at every one, look at the ones you really like, ones that really make you think that's a good composition, and then copy that. I know Titian talks about, Degas talks about Mantegna, and some others. I don't have one in here, but I remember copying Chardin to understand his edges. I remember copying I copied a Paxton head to see what palette he was using to get those notes, because they seemed extremely intense to me. And I found out that I couldn't do it with Gamel's earth palette. I had to actually move over and do something Gamel said he didn't do, and that is put cadmiums in the face. And so but you see why one might copy, right? Does that mean I'm going to become a little stylistically, somebody or other? No, you might, as I said, you might acquire their application of paint because it's more effective than the one you've got. but it doesn't mean you're going to become one of those little guys, right? All painters are eclectic. They borrow from everywhere. And Degas saying you can learn something from anybody is in that class of conversation. But yeah, and what else? Oh, I copied a Bouguereau head. Again, I wanted to understand how much paint he was using, whether he was using mediums or not. And I found he was using a fairly limited palette. My palette was very adequate to do what he was doing, and that his paint was that I could make the paint do exactly what his was doing by making it merely thinner and use soft brushes. And I didn't need to use any glazing, anything. I didn't have to use any devices to get his exact look. And so that's a thing, right? You're trying to understand whether these guys you're reading about are using some tricky glazing or some miracle something or other. Well, yeah. And again, that's, as it were, stylistic, right? Some people use glazes. Some people, as Paxton says, keep it as simple as possible. The simplest is the best in terms of mediums. But that's you know, I hope that begins to come across to you what I mean. I want each of you as students of painting, want you to grow into be yourself with the knowledge acquired over time of the masters. But it doesn't imply style. It's not the style of these guys, except to the degree you mean method, and then it would be slightly in that class. Now, in this case here, the one on the left, that's mine. It's a copy of a Raphael. And the reason I did that, and I did it from the beginning to end, is I wanted to, I was disgusted with my mark making when I was drawing with a point. And so I looked around to see somebody whose line making I liked, and I rather liked Raphael's. And I wouldn't tell you I liked every mark in this painting, but I decided to do it as if it were an authentic whole copy. And but you can see there are places where I was going out of my way to try to make it do that mark. And I found that I was able to get his sense of touch into my muscles, into my memory, into my muscle memory, I guess you could say. And because you have to make the point, you have to make the point just so, and then you have to make the point move just so. The touch, the amount of pressure you put down, and how you draw it up, how long a line you memorize. Those are all in my hands too. But what we're talking about here is borrowing from the masters. That didn't become. I had no reason to become stylistically some Raphael per se. There are things that he hadn't figured out yet for sure in his drawing. Doesn't mean he isn't totally adequate for the purpose, and that he isn't. It also doesn't mean he's not a good draftsman. I mean, this is good. This is very beautiful shape and form making stuff. But when it came to that issue of of finding touch, finding a better way to make marks, I didn't become a Raphael. I merely began when I was going to draw an extended line. I began to let my hand be involved in it in terms of how much pressure. So I would have had to already learn the look that I was trying to get, the value I was trying to put down, and the thinness of the line. And then I began to simply use touch, and the line was then more beautiful. It actually got across to me the idea of in everything you do in our world, there's a certain aesthetic, a certain beauty. Make marks, make beautiful marks if you can. They're better than klutzy ones. It doesn't hurt anything. I'm not saying make pretty, and that isn't the point. But you'll find that a certain amount of grace goes well with the territory that we're in, right? Typically, we think of it that way. There are some. I mean, they talk about from time to time Rembrandt and what he does, and he almost defies the idea of that graceful line. And maybe that's what a lot of the construction method buys into or works from or something like that. On the right is a Degas, the copy from a Botticelli. It's nice to have that, a revisit the Botticelli. This is presumably that's this Birth of Venus. But there's, what's he doing? What's he borrowing? He doesn't make graceful women. He tends not to do that. He doesn't, what else does he do? What did he learn from Botticelli? Did he become a stylist? Did he become a Botticelli stylist? His pictures look like almost brutally true, right? They look like their realism beyond anything Botticelli could do. And I don't say that not appreciating fully, and Degas would talk about how true he is, or I think it's Degas. But so why is he copying him? And again, I would revisit the idea that you copy people for various reasons. When you're a beginning painter, it's useful to just be looking at pictures, and when you think that might be worth hanging around for a while, well, copying is the way to hang around that picture for a while. And things will get into you. You'll begin to pick up knowledge. You'll begin to pick up the mind of that painter. Doesn't mean you're going to become stylistically like him, however. And that's really all I have for you this time around. So I hope that works. I better take a walk to the beginning of this. Oops, didn't mean to do that. And see if there's anything I've left out. I'm going to go just right up to the. You say that copying the style of other artists is a poor thing, and yet you endorse the influence of the past. Yeah. So the influence of the past, it's the long study, really, of what did somebody quoted, one of you guys recently quoted to me that just, who was it who said it takes 300 years to learn to paint? Yeah, that's a really good way to put it, right? So we're still learning how to paint what we see in front of us over time. We, meaning man. And, that's one of those things where, in these times, everything is about my personal statement and my style. But there's always been this deep and profound respect for the truth of nature and for the ongoing evolution of that, of what it takes to bring it about even more so, right? For us to express it even better. So that underlying thing there, people from time to time pop up heavy with style and do their thing and vanish again. But you won't find that kind of burden on the very best painters. You won't find style is one of the greater rarities in the sense of a self-conscious, I'd say a twist of nature, a torturing of nature, a manipulation of nature to get a kind of a peculiar look, a personal look. I found that the painters I respect the most, in one sense, the only personality they have is because they made it with their hands, not with three other people's hands. But in reality, what I love is their commitment to the truth. And I think in the same way as you'd expect, as I've said before, a fiction writer. You're not going to like a fiction writer who's so interested in his style that you can't even read the book as, or let's put it this way, if he puts style over substance, in other words, the truth of what he's saying is subjected to, to his brilliant way of saying things. So, do you really want, which one do you want to be? But I'm just saying that's my orientation has always been to stay within the framework of more powerful, more true, in the sense of like nature than it has been. And I don't mean realism, by the way, would you believe? But it's also in a deeper search for the understanding of what the very nature of our form is. And so those two things, you can get the interpretation from the masters, you can get the interpretation of nature, and you can get for example, the design of a rectangle, ways of expressing things better, including form, but even including stories. The expression of a narrative. So copying the style of other artists. Yeah. So let me just say the last thing on this. When I say the style of other artists, I mean if you live in somebody else's style. But borrowing what other people have, they say finding best practices, requires you to do that kind of a search, and sometimes that requires copying, and those copyings will make you have to live in whatever they're doing, which will include, shall we say, their style, in the sense of stylization. But that is one of the things you learn after copying. Copying, the very few painters actually are interested in that. What they're interested in is this powerful expression of the truth before them, and with or you could even say of expression of their pictorial ideas or even their narrative ideas in the most powerfully true in terms of the look of nature way before them. So that's all I mean by that. So when I say creating your life, Do you sit there and say, I'm going to become a Rubens, I'm going to be a sergeant, I'm going to be a this or that? Or do you simply take nature as your guide and begin to find yourself? That's where I'd put you. That's where I'd suggest you live. Thank you, James. Thank you all. That got a little longer than I meant to be for it to, but again, thank you, each of you, for your donations this time and for your ongoing comments, sharing, subscribing. Keep pushing it if you can. And I think we'll leave it at that and see you in the next one. Okay?